My parents always said I was too sensitive, so I didn't say a word when they gave my childhood bedroom to my sister's cat or when they used my college fund for her third wedding. But when I found out they were selling my grandfather's war medals on Facebook Marketplace, I booked a flight, showed up uninvited, and what I did in that living room changed everything. I, 32M, always heard the same phrase growing up whenever I expressed frustration or disappointment. My parents would exchange that familiar look and dismiss my feelings with a simple explanation that I was being too sensitive. After 32 years of hearing it, I'd learned to keep my mouth shut rather than deal with their dismissive attitudes. The pattern started early. When I was 12 and complained about my younger sister getting the bigger bedroom simply because she cried louder, I was told I was overreacting. When I questioned why she got a car for her 16th birthday while I had to work summers to save for mine, the response was always the same. I was being dramatic, making mountains out of molehills, reading too much into normal family dynamics. By the time I graduated high school, I'd stopped voicing my concerns altogether. It seemed easier to accept their version of reality than to constantly be labeled as the problem child who couldn't handle life's little disappointments. The first real test of my newfound silence came when I was 22. I'd been living in a cramped apartment near campus, working part-time while finishing my engineering degree. During winter break, I came home to find my childhood bedroom completely transformed. Gone were my posters, my desk, my bookshelf filled with science fiction novels I'd collected since middle school. Instead, an elaborate cat playground occupied the space, complete with climbing trees, luxury beds, and automated feeding stations. My parents explained that my sister's Persian cat needed a proper environment after she moved back home following her first divorce. The cat required specific temperature control and couldn't be housed in the basement like a common pet. My old room had the best light and ventilation in the house, they reasoned. Since I only visited during breaks anyway, it made perfect sense to convert the space. I stood in the doorway, watching the cat lounge on a velvet cushion where my bed used to be, and felt that familiar surge of frustration. But instead of arguing, I simply nodded and asked where I'd be sleeping during visits. The pull-out couch in the den would be fine, my mother assured me. It was only temporary anyway, just until my sister got back on her feet. That temporary arrangement lasted 3 years. The second major blow came during my senior year. I'd been planning to attend graduate school, having already been accepted to a prestigious program with partial funding. The remaining tuition would come from the college fund my grandparents had established when I was born, money my parents had assured me would be available when needed. 2 weeks before the enrollment deadline, my father called with news that would reshape my immediate future. My sister was getting married again, this time to a successful businessman who insisted on a lavish ceremony. The wedding would cost nearly $40,000, and unfortunately, they'd had to dip into my education fund to cover the expenses. The money would be replaced eventually, he promised, but not in time for graduate school. I sat in my dorm room, acceptance letter in one hand and phone in the other, processing this information. My sister's third engagement in 5 years was being funded by my educational future. When I asked about alternatives or payment plans, my father's voice took on that tired tone I knew well. I was being unrealistic about the cost of graduate school anyway, he suggested. Plenty of people succeeded without advanced degrees. Maybe this was a sign that I should focus on getting real work experience instead of hiding in academia. I withdrew my graduate school application the next day and started job hunting instead. The pattern continued over the years. My sister moved in and out of my parents' house regularly, each transition treated as a family emergency requiring immediate financial support. Her second divorce necessitated legal fees that somehow came from the small inheritance my grandmother had left me. Her brief stint as a failed entrepreneur resulted in business debts that my parents covered using money they'd borrowed against their retirement fund, money they'd planned to repay using savings earmarked for family expenses. Each time, I watched silently as my needs were pushed aside for her latest crisis. Each time, I swallowed my objections rather than be labeled as the selfish son who couldn't support his struggling sister during difficult times. Moving across the country for work provided some relief from the constant drama. Distance made it easier to maintain my policy of silence when my sister's problems inevitably became family problems. Phone calls became brief check-ins where I listened to updates about her various struggles without offering opinions or objections. But some boundaries, I discovered, couldn't be respected even from 2,000 miles away. Last month, I received a text from my cousin that made my blood run cold. She'd been browsing Facebook Marketplace when she stumbled across a listing that caught her attention. Someone in my parents' city was selling a collection of World War II military medals, including a Purple Heart and Bronze Star. The photos showed medals I recognized immediately, medals that had sat in a place of honor on my grandfather's dresser throughout my childhood. My grandfather had served in the Pacific Theater, earning those decorations during some of the war's bloodiest campaigns. He'd rarely talked about his service, but those medals represented the most significant chapters of his life. Before his death 10 years ago, he'd specifically requested that they be passed down to me, the only grandchild who'd shown interest in military history and his wartime experiences. I'd assumed the medals were safely stored somewhere in my parents' house, waiting for an appropriate time to be formally transferred. The idea that they were being sold like unwanted household items on a Facebook Marketplace felt like a violation of everything my grandfather had represented. My hands shook as I took screenshots of the listing. The asking price was $800 for the entire collection, described simply as vintage military items from estate sale. No mention of their historical significance, no acknowledgement of the blood and sacrifice they represented. Just vintage items being converted to cash. I called my parents immediately, my carefully maintained silence finally breaking after years of accumulated grievances. My mother answered with her usual cheerful tone, asking about my work and commenting on the weather. I cut through the pleasantries and asked directly about the medals. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, my mother's voice returned, noticeably less cheerful than before. She explained that they'd been going through old storage boxes, trying to declutter before their planned move to a smaller house. The medals had been sitting and used in a drawer for years, and my sister had suggested selling them to help cover moving expenses. When I reminded her of my grandfather's wishes regarding those medals, my mother's tone shifted to the familiar dismissive register I'd heard countless times before. I was being overly sentimental about objects that were just collecting dust. My grandfather was gone, and holding on to every memento wasn't healthy grieving. The medals would be better off with a collector who'd actually appreciate them rather than sitting forgotten in storage. The conversation ended with my mother suggesting that I was making too big a deal out of the situation, that I needed to be more understanding of their financial pressures during this transitional period. My father called later that evening, echoing the same themes. They'd raised me to be practical and level-headed, not the type of person who'd get emotional over material possessions. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying decades of similar conversations. Every dismissed concern, every minimized feeling, every time my needs had been sacrificed for my sister's latest emergency or whim. The medals weren't just military decorations. They were the final straw in a pattern I'd enabled through years of silent acceptance. I booked a flight the next morning. The decision felt surreal as I packed a bag and arranged time off work. For 32 years, I'd been the accommodating son, the one who absorbed disappointment without complaint, who prioritized family harmony over personal needs. The prospect of confronting my parents directly, of demanding answers and accountability, felt like stepping into an alternate version of my life. During the 5-hour flight, I rehearsed conversations and planned strategies. I'd arrive unannounced to prevent them from preparing defensive arguments or hiding evidence. I'd document everything, including the Facebook listing and any communications about the sale. Most importantly, I'd make it clear that my years of silent acceptance were officially over. The Uber ride from the airport to my childhood home gave me time for final preparations. I screenshot the marketplace listing again, noting that it had been updated with sale pending status. Someone had already agreed to buy my grandfather's legacy for $800. The urgency of the situation crystallized my resolve. I knocked on the front door instead of using my old key, a small gesture that felt symbolically appropriate. My mother answered looking genuinely surprised, immediately launching into questions about my unexpected visit. I told her we needed to talk about the medals and asked to come inside. The living room looked exactly as I remembered, family photos covering every surface, my sister's latest professional headshots prominently displayed on the mantelpiece. My parents settled onto their familiar spots on the couch while I remained standing, a positioning that felt more confrontational than I'd intended, but somehow appropriate for what was about to happen. I started by asking them to show me the medals. My father immediately became defensive, wanting to know why I'd flown across the country without warning to discuss something we'd already resolved over the phone. I explained that we hadn't resolved anything, that I was here to collect property that belonged to me according to my grandfather's explicit wishes. My mother tried to redirect the conversation toward my dramatic reaction, suggesting that I was letting emotions cloud my judgment about a practical family decision. She reminded me that they'd raised me better than this, that I was acting like a stranger rather than their son who understood family priorities. I asked again to see the medals. The next few minutes involved a series of deflections and delays. My father claimed they were packed away somewhere in storage, too difficult to access on short notice. My mother suggested that I was being unreasonable by demanding immediate access to items they'd already committed to selling. Both of them seemed genuinely confused by my insistence on seeing physical proof of what we were discussing. Finally, I pulled out my phone and showed them the Facebook listing. I asked if they recognized the medals in the photographs. The silence that followed was different from their usual dismissive pauses. This was the quiet of people who'd been caught in something they couldn't easily explain away. My father's expression shifted from annoyance to something that looked almost like embarrassment. My mother recovered first, launching into an explanation about timing and financial pressures and the practical difficulties of coordinating with me across multiple time zones. The buyer was a legitimate collector who'd promised to preserve the medals appropriately. The sale was already in progress, contracts signed, money nearly exchanged. Backing out now would create legal complications and damage their reputation in the community. I listened to this elaborate justification, then asked a simple question that cut through all the rationalizations. I asked why they hadn't called me before listing the medals, why my grandfather's specific wishes had never been considered worth discussing with the person he'd chosen as beneficiary. My father's response revealed the core of their thinking more clearly than years of psychological analysis might have. He told me that I'd never shown any interest in the medals during the 10 years since my grandfather's death, that my silence on the subject had been interpreted as indifference. If the medals had been important to me, I should have claimed them years ago instead of leaving them in their care indefinitely. The accusation was so perfectly representative of our family dynamics that I almost laughed. My silence, cultivated through decades of being labeled too sensitive whenever I expressed wants or needs, was now being used as evidence of my indifference to something precious. My learned behavior of not making demands was being interpreted as proof that I had no legitimate demands to make. I asked them to call the buyer and cancel the sale. Both parents immediately began explaining why that was impossible. The buyer had rearranged his schedule for pickup, had already made financial arrangements, was expecting to complete the transaction that afternoon. My sudden appearance and demands were creating an unfair situation for everyone involved. Surely I could understand their position and be reasonable about finding an alternative solution. I told them I'd pay double the selling price to keep the medals in the family. My offer was dismissed as impractical and unfair to the committed buyer. My mother suggested that I was letting pride override common sense, that I was creating drama where none needed to exist. My father added that my willingness to overpay proved I hadn't been thinking clearly about the situation, that I was making emotional decisions rather than rational ones. Their resistance to what seemed like an obvious compromise clarified something important about their motivations. This wasn't really about money or practicality or commitment to buyers. This was about maintaining their authority to make decisions about family property without consulting me, about preserving their right to prioritize my sister's needs over mine without interference. I walked to the mantelpiece and picked up one of my sister's professional photos, a glamorous headshot from her brief modeling phase 3 years earlier. I asked where my photos were displayed in this family gallery. My parents exchanged glances but didn't answer the question directly. Instead, my mother launched into a speech about how proud they were of both their children, how they'd always supported my achievements even if I didn't need as much encouragement as my sister did. My success in engineering was evidence that their parenting had been effective, proof that I'd developed the independence and resilience necessary for adult life. I set down the photograph and asked them to think about what they'd just said. My sister's struggles earned her financial support, bedroom priority, and college fund access. while my success earned me independence and resilience and the assumption that I needed nothing from them. The conversation that followed revealed layers of family dysfunction I'd been too close to recognize clearly. My parents had genuinely convinced themselves that their differential treatment was appropriate and fair. My sister's needs were immediate and visible, requiring urgent family intervention, while my needs were theoretical and manageable, safely ignored without consequences. My father explained that they'd always known I was stronger than my sister, more capable of handling disappointment and setbacks. My emotional stability had been an asset that freed them to focus resources where they were most needed. My silence over the years had confirmed their assessment that I was resilient enough to thrive without the level of support my sister required. I asked if it had ever occurred to them that my silence might indicate hurt rather than strength, that my lack of demands might reflect resignation rather than contentment. My mother's response was immediate and defensive. She told me I was rewriting history to support a narrative of victimhood that didn't match reality. I'd been loved and supported throughout my childhood and young adulthood, given every opportunity to succeed, encouraged to pursue my goals without interference. If I chose to interpret their trust in my capabilities as neglect, that said more about my current mindset than their actual parenting. The doorbell rang before I could respond, interrupting what was becoming a fundamental reckoning with decades of family dynamics. My parents looked at each other with expressions I couldn't quite read, a mixture of relief and anxiety that suggested they knew who was at the door. My father stood to answer while my mother remained seated, her posture suddenly tense in a way that made me suspicious about the timing of this interruption. The voices from the entryway were too quiet for me to distinguish words, but the tone suggested a planned meeting rather than an unexpected visitor. When my father returned to the living room, he was followed by a man in his 50s carrying a small briefcase and wearing the kind of casual business attire that suggested official purpose. My parents introduced him as the buyer who'd come to complete the metal transaction, apologizing for the family discussion that had delayed their appointment. I looked at this stranger who was about to walk away with my grandfather's military decorations, and something fundamental shifted in my understanding of the situation. This wasn't a spontaneous sale motivated by sudden financial pressures. This was a planned transaction that my parents had scheduled knowing I was flying across the country to prevent it. The buyer seemed uncomfortable with the family tension, suggesting that he could return later if this wasn't a good time to complete their business. My father assured him that everything was fine, that we were just having a minor family discussion that wouldn't interfere with their agreement. I introduced myself to the buyer and asked if he was aware of the metal's family significance and my grandfather's wishes regarding their inheritance. The man looked genuinely surprised by this information, glancing between my parents and me with growing understanding of the situation he'd walked into. What happened next unfolded with a clarity that surprised everyone in the room, including myself. I explained to the buyer that the metals had been promised to me by their original owner, that the current sale was happening without my knowledge or consent, and that I was prepared to match or exceed his offer to keep them in the family. The man listened carefully, then asked my parents directly if what I was saying was accurate. The silence stretched long enough to become its own answer. The buyer closed his briefcase and stood up. He told my parents that he wasn't comfortable completing a transaction that involved disputed family property, that he'd need clear documentation of ownership and family consensus before proceeding. He apologized for the inconvenience and left his contact information in case they resolved the situation and still wanted to sell. After he left, my parents turned their full attention to me with expressions of barely controlled anger. My father accused me of sabotaging a legitimate business transaction through emotional manipulation and false claims. My mother added that I'd embarrassed them in front of a respected community member, damaging their reputation through selfish behavior. I asked them to produce my grandfather's will or any documentation showing that the metals had been legally transferred to them rather than held in trust for me. The question hung in the air like a challenge they couldn't meet. After several minutes of uncomfortable silence, my mother admitted that my grandfather's will had specified that his military decorations should be passed to me. But she argued that the practical reality of caring for his possessions for 10 years had created different obligations and priorities. I told them I wanted the metals immediately, along with any other items my grandfather had designated for me in his will. What followed was a systematic search through closets, storage boxes, and forgotten corners of the house. We found items I'd forgotten existed. My grandfather's compass from his Pacific service, his field manual annotated in his careful handwriting, photographs from his unit that I'd never seen before. Each discovery felt like recovering pieces of family history that had been deliberately hidden from me. The medals themselves were in a safety deposit box at their bank, requiring a trip that consumed the rest of the afternoon. Sitting in the bank parking lot with my grandfather's decorations finally in my possession, I realized that this confrontation had accomplished something beyond recovering stolen property. For the first time in my adult life, I demanded something from my family and received it. Not through compromise or negotiation or patient waiting, but through direct confrontation and refusal to accept their dismissive explanations. The experience felt simultaneously foreign and natural, like using a muscle I'd forgotten I possessed. Update 1. The conversation with my parents continued over dinner that evening, though the dynamic had shifted considerably from our morning confrontation. Having the medals physically in my possession seemed to change their approach from defensive justification to grudging acknowledgement of my position. My mother asked if I was planning to pursue legal action regarding the other incidents I'd mentioned, the bedroom conversion and college fund situation. I told her I was more interested in understanding how our family had reached this point than in seeking retroactive justice for past grievances. My father admitted that they'd grown accustomed to making decisions without consulting me because I'd never objected to their choices before. My pattern of silent acceptance had created an assumption that my preferences either didn't exist or weren't strong enough to warrant consideration. I explained that my silence had been a learned response to being consistently labeled as too sensitive whenever I'd expressed disagreement with family decisions. Over time, I'd concluded that maintaining peace was more important than advocating for my own interests. The recognition of this dynamic seemed genuinely surprising to both parents. They'd interpreted my accommodation as evidence of maturity and family loyalty rather than resignation and suppressed frustration. My mother said she'd never realized that their responses to my childhood concerns had been dismissive rather than appropriately corrective. We talked through specific incidents from my adolescence and young adulthood, with my parents gradually acknowledging patterns they'd been unconscious of at the time. My father admitted that my sister's dramatic responses to disappointment had trained them to prioritize crisis management over preventive consideration of everyone's needs. The evening ended with tentative agreements about future communication and decision-making processes. My parents committed to consulting me before making choices that affected my interests or inheritance, while I agreed to be more direct about expressing my preferences rather than defaulting to silent acceptance. Update 2. 3 weeks after returning home, I received a call from my sister for the first time in over a year. She'd learned about the medal situation from our parents and wanted to express her support for my actions. Her perspective on family dynamics proved surprisingly aligned with my own experiences. She told me she'd been aware of the differential treatment, but had assumed I preferred the independence it provided rather than the constant supervision and intervention she experienced. Her frequent crises and need for support had been as exhausting for her as they'd been frustrating for me, creating a dynamic where she felt infantilized while I felt ignored. We arranged to meet during her next visit home, the first time we'd had substantial contact since our childhood. The conversation revealed that both of us had been shaped by family patterns that served neither of our actual needs or preferences. My sister admitted that she'd sometimes manufactured crises because dramatic problems were the only reliable way to receive attention and support from our parents. Meanwhile, I'd learned to minimize my needs because any expression of difficulty was met with dismissal or comparison to her more pressing situations. Understanding these complementary adaptations helped explain decades of sibling distance and resentment. We'd been competing for different types of recognition within a family system that couldn't accommodate both our needs simultaneously. My sister also revealed that she'd been uncomfortable with many of the decisions our parents had made regarding my property and opportunities, but she'd benefited from them too directly to object effectively. The guilt over accepting advantages that came at my expense had contributed to her avoidance of family gatherings where I was present. Update 3. 6 months later, my relationship with my parents has stabilized into something more honest and equitable than our previous dynamic. They've made efforts to include me in family decisions and acknowledge my perspectives, while I've worked to express my needs clearly rather than expecting them to guess what I want. My sister and I have developed a genuine friendship for the first time since childhood, built on recognition of how family patterns had pitted us against each other unnecessarily. We've established boundaries with our parents that protect both of our autonomy while maintaining family connections. The medals now sit in a place of honor in my apartment, alongside the other military items my grandfather intended for me. But more importantly, the confrontation that led to their recovery taught me something valuable about the difference between keeping peace and enabling dysfunction. I still prefer harmony to conflict in most situations, but I've learned to distinguish between reasonable compromise and self-abandonment. My parents were right that I'd always been sensitive to family dynamics, but they were wrong that sensitivity was something I needed to suppress rather than trust. The experience changed how I approach relationships generally, both personal and professional. I advocate for my interests more directly and interpret pushback as information rather than rejection. The skills I learned confronting my parents have improved my career negotiations and romantic relationships in ways I didn't anticipate. Most significantly, I've stopped interpreting my needs as excessive or my feelings as problems to be managed. The voice that labeled me as too sensitive for 32 years has been replaced by one that recognizes sensitivity as a valuable navigation tool for complex human situations. My grandfather's medals remind me daily that some battles are worth fighting, that honor sometimes requires confrontation rather than accommodation, and that silence in the face of wrong actions enables those actions to continue. Those lessons feel like the most valuable inheritance he could have left me.